power stations are going into overdrive as people tune in.
Well, I'm relieved to hear that.
Yeah, well, so, well, anyway, how long did you have this morning at your select committee? How long were you chairing that for this morning? Was it a long time? 2 hours?
It was over 2 hours.
Well, we have no intention of keeping you here for that long. As a committee, we don't even know what 2 hours looks like.
You have a slightly smaller membership than the Brexit Select Committee.
Slightly.
Although some crossover, which is now a chance for revenge.
So am I allowed to say
my colleagues?
Can I say you're amongst friends, or would that be stretching it slightly? Right, okay, enough jollity. Hilary, look, it was very kind of you to come here today. You wrote to me a few weeks ago, but I think it was before the recess, asking the procedure committee to look into the meaningful vote. Can I just ask you why you wrote to us? What were you trying to achieve by that?
I will indeed answer that. Can I just say, to start with, thank you very much for inviting me to give evidence, and to the committee for responding to the letter that I wrote. Can I reiterate what I said in my letter to you of yesterday? We have no intention as the Brexit Select Committee of treading on your toes in relation to this specific question, and I will do my best to explain the committee's thinking in making that recommendation to you. But if you ask me about other things, which I'm very happy to try and answer, it will be me answering, but not on behalf of the committee.
Okay.
Right. The reason we did that was because we felt that it was important that the House of Commons has a chance to test a number of different responses to any withdrawal agreement. And having taken evidence, and having heard in particular from Lord Lisvane that under the normal procedure, when you get to the moment of interruption, you can vote on one amendment and then you come to the main motion, we thought, well, that wouldn't really give enough opportunity, given the diversity of views that there are about what we should do about Brexit and what kind of withdrawal we should have, that wouldn't give an opportunity to enable the House to test those out. And that's why we passed the ball on to you and said, look, you're the experts, could you please advise on how this might be done, how you could construct a business of the House motion that would enable the Speaker to select a number of amendments. And the clear presumption of the committee in making that recommendation to you was the normal procedure would apply, namely, you'd vote on the amendments first, and then you would come to the main motion, either as amended or not. And I was surprised, I have to say, when the Secretary of State's memorandum appeared before you, proposing a different approach, because that's not what I think any of us were expecting.
But if it wasn't what anyone was expecting, I struggle to see why there was why you felt, or your committee felt, the need to involve the procedure committee. If you feel that the normal procedures in essence should apply, then what is it that we were meant to say beyond the normal procedures should apply?
We didn't. We thought the normal procedures, in the light of what Lord Lisvane said to us, where you'd only get to vote on one amendment at that moment, how could one give the House the chance to vote on more than one amendment before proceeding to the main question? Right. That's why we passed it to you.
So it seems to me that your committee wants us to follow one course of action. And you've seen the government memorandum, and they're quite keen for us to follow another course of action. But the great thing is that this committee is immune from those sort of pressures, and that we will ultimately recommend our own course of action, which is why it's so good that you're here to give evidence and we have so many questions for you. So who am I going to call first? Will.
And then, as you mentioned it specifically, Hilary, the idea of amendments, the Act is quite clear in terms of ratification of any withdrawal agreement. I think you said what kind of withdrawal agreement. It won't be a question of what kind, it will be the thing that is laid before Parliament and the government have negotiated. And so the Act is quite clear that it has to be approved one way or the other. So the idea of amending it is really not possible, is it?
Oh, it certainly is possible, because one can conceive of amendments of substance. For example, the House could say, we approve the withdrawal agreement, but the government should set out how it intends to keep the UK in a customs union with the European Union when it engages in the negotiations on the future relationship. Or the House could say, we're happy to approve the withdrawal agreement, but we want the government to give an undertaking that it will legislate to ensure that the House will have a vote on any treaty or treaties that emerge from the negotiations when the second phase, the future relationship, has been sorted. There's a very good paper which I'm sure you've seen that Jack Simpson-Caird, Matthew Bevington and Alan Wager produced, which has a very long list of possible amendments.
I have not seen that, but I've got the law in front of me. And what it says is that it has to be approved. So if something is amended, how can it be approved one way or the other? This is
Well, I think it depends on the nature of the amendment. Now, I realise that one of the arguments the government has made in support of its alternative approach, that it has suggested in the memorandum to your committee, is they've raised the question of legal uncertainty about what it is that the House has decided. Now, I don't recall, but I stand to be corrected, whether this was raised as a concern during the extensive debates we had on the withdrawal bill. That's the first thing. And the second thing, of course, I'm not a lawyer, and I bow to the greater knowledge and expertise of lawyers, but it seems to me that there are amendments to the withdrawal agreement that would certainly be fatal. So, for example, what would be the equivalent of a reasoned amendment to the second reading of a bill declines to give a second reading of the bill because we don't like this, this and this.
Would that not be the same, though, as voting against it?
Well, no, it wouldn't be the same. Because, no, it would have the same effect in that the withdrawal agreement wouldn't be approved. But it would be the House of Commons saying to the government, this is the reason why, because the truth is we may end up with people voting against a withdrawal agreement for completely opposite reasons. And that's why the argument that we're putting is that there are a range of views in the House of Commons, and therefore allowing those to be tested and voted on before you get to the government's main motion seems to me to be a reasonable approach. And that was the expectation in which the committee made its recommendation to you to look at the question of how a number of amendments could be considered.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Benn. You mentioned obviously the range of views across the House, but the majority view when the EU withdrawal bill was going through was that there should be a meaningful vote. So just to be absolutely clear for this committee, what is your understanding of what a meaningful vote actually is?
I think a meaningful vote is one in which the range of views that there clearly are in the House of Commons are able to be debated and voted upon before the government's motion is then voted upon, either amended or unamended. I think saying to the House of Commons there's only two choices, you can vote for our withdrawal agreement or we're leaving with no deal, is not a meaningful vote.
Okay, another question I would have that kind of follows on from that is, obviously we are having these conversations in Parliament and kind of, it seems to be a conversation that's going above everybody's head. What do you think the understanding of a meaningful vote is to members of the public?
I'm not sure how much time the public in general has spent contemplating that question. I think, look, it depends what view people take of BrExit, really. It would inform how they look upon the way in which we are handling this. For example, those who are arguing that there should be a people's vote would think probably that it wouldn't be meaningful if there wasn't a chance for that view to be tested in the House. Others who think that what the government may come back with would leave us much too closely aligned to the European Union might well want to be able to express that as a reason why they're declining to give support to the withdrawal agreement, which illustrates the point I made. There are a range of views, and it comes right the way back to the phrase taking back control. And remember, there was a time when the government wasn't proposing to give us, as the House of Commons, a vote. I remember questioning the Prime Minister when she appeared before the Liaison Committee in, I think it was December 2016, and at that time the government's policy was not to answer the question, will we have a vote? Now we've got a vote, and I think the extensive debate during the passage of the Withdrawal Act, the bill, was all about how to make that, in the language, meaningful.
So you think the government is trying to sell us a pup?
I think the government is trying to maximise the chances that it will get its withdrawal agreement through. That's what I think the government is doing. That's what all governments would do in circumstances when they're trying to get something through that is a bit tricky. and Brexit is definitely tricky.
Right. Very quickly.
Have there been missed opportunities at the point when there was a strong push to get a vote on the deal before Parliament? Were there missed opportunities to properly define what meaningful vote really meant, and to get a sense from the ministers and Secretary of States who were in charge at the time to explain their understanding of the phrase meaningful vote?
It's a very good question. I think we spent a lot of time debating what different people thought was meaningful when the legislation was going through. This then, in part, brings us on to the question of motions in neutral terms, because in certain eventualities we could end up with that. And we also said in the Select Committee report that if we were facing no deal, then we're clear that Parliament should be given a clear opportunity to express its view, and just saying to Parliament, just take note of the fact that I've just made a statement, well, that wouldn't be meaningful either. So it's an issue at different stages depending on the outcome. But look, I think it's precisely because the government is aware that there are a range of views that, of course, the government is trying to structure things so that if it does succeed in getting a deal, and we all hope that that is the case, but that's not clear at the moment, that it can bring it back and get it through. But ultimately, these are matters for Parliament, because Parliament can decide whether it likes the business motion that government has put down. It can amend the business motion. And if this is about taking back control, then we might as well exercise it as parliamentarians.
Helen.
Thank you. Were the House to vote down the government's motion on the withdrawal agreement,
Yeah.
do you think a no deal is inevitable?
No.
Could you spell out for the committee why you say that, given that the law as it stands does present us with that choice?
Because as I've said consistently, and this is just my personal view, I do not believe that there is a majority in the House of Commons for leaving the European Union with no deal. There isn't. That's my assessment. So what would the government do in those circumstances? It would be a huge rejection of 2.5 years of negotiating. But I don't think the government, I can't speak for the government, but I don't think the government would sit on its hands and say, oh well, we're leaving with no deal. Despite ministers having repeatedly said, well, no deal's better than a bad deal. I just don't think the government would do that, because the publication of the technical notices that have come out over the summer, the issues that they raise, the fact that we are, as a nation, patently not ready for the consequences of no deal, organisationally. The evidence that Caroline Noakes gave yesterday in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee, in which she raised a very practical question of how are employers going to differentiate between EU citizens who continue to have the right to work under the commitments that the government has given, and those who arrived that morning, both of them bearing EU passports. How do you differentiate between them? There's a really practical example of how we are not ready to make this happen, never mind the economic consequences which the government's own assessment revealed to us, thanks to the decisions of the House, show the impact it would have. So I don't think it is inevitable, and I don't personally believe that it will happen, because either the government and or Parliament will decide, well, we need to take a different approach.
So in that eventuality that we were to vote down the main motion, you are saying you don't think that we would just canter on to the 29th of March with no action, but at the same time, do you have a clear view as to what the parliamentary route would be to avoid no deal?
Well, I think the first responsibility would be on the government. What's government going to do if its strategy has been defeated? Well, one option is to say, OK, we get the message, we're going to have to adopt a different strategy, for which we think we might be able to get a majority in the House of Commons. So that is one option. So I'd say the first responsibility rests on the government of the day, not to permit that to happen.
And how do you think our European partners would respond in that situation? Do you think they would be prepared to go back to the drawing board?
Well, they would finally realise the extent of the political problem in trying to get a withdrawal agreement through, clearly, because it had just been lost. I don't think they want no deal either. Now, there are options. There are options to extend Article 50, and indeed, one of the recommendations we made in our 6th report was looking at precisely the question that you've been asking me. We didn't accept that rejection of the deal would mean that we would inevitably leave with no deal, and we said one thing the government should be prepared to do in those circumstances is to extend Article 50, so that's one option. There is another option which we were discussing this morning on our evidence session. The government could come back later if it wanted to sort of hang in there and say, well, that's all there is, we're not changing our policy, and put the matter to the House again. And we did ask the Clerk of the House this morning about whether there would be an absolute bar on considering the same motion again. And what he said to us was if the House wants to look at that again, then it could do so. So that is another option.
There are some time limits in the bill, though, aren't there? I can't quite bring them to mind.
Well, there are time limits, but there are time limits about the government making a statement, and then there are time limits about motions to take note. But the government could bring another motion saying we're going to change our policy, or we're going to go and talk to our European partners and see what we can come back with further. I mean, the government could, I don't think it'll happen, but the government could say, well, we'll put the deal to a referendum of the British people because the House of Commons is deadlocked and hasn't been able to approve it. There are a number of options, but what I'm saying in response to your very direct and pertinent question is I just simply do not believe that either the government or Parliament are going to sit on their hands, watch the clock run down and fall out with no deal at all from the 1st of April. I don't think it's going to happen, and I don't think a responsible government would do it, nor would a responsible House of Commons.
Can I?
One more.
I was going to follow up on David's point.
Okay, just one more.
Which is this issue of how significant do you think it is that when the public watch the telly and watch the debate, they understand the procedures of the House?
I think we should do everything that we can to try and make them comprehensible. They're not always comprehensible to all of us. Let's be honest. And
you are speaking to the procedure.
Well, I was going to say, but you are. Well, I was talking about myself. You are the fount of expertise, subject to the advice that we get from the clerks. But I think once you get into the debate, and there are people getting up and saying, well, I don't like this deal because it's too close to Europe, or I don't like this deal because it's not going to guarantee we continue to have friction-free trade with our European partners, or I don't like this because we're not sure whether Parliament will get a vote on the treaties that come out of the second part of the negotiation, or any one of a number of things. I think it will be reasonably clear to people what's being voted on, and then those who are covering our affairs need to say, well, this particular vote is about this issue, and the procedure is there to enable us to take decisions, and then it's our responsibility and others to explain to the public what it is we're discussing and what it is that we've decided.
Thank you.
No, Alison.
Thank you. You mentioned within the committee report that you reckon a sort of minimum of 5 days would be required to debate on this. I'm kind of concerned about the timescales that we have. We don't have very long to go until the end of March. There's some suggestion that negotiations might carry on until very late in the day as well. How possible do you think it is that we may get to the point where we're debating and voting on this and still we don't know exactly what we're going to vote on?
Well, it's possible, depending on how the negotiations go. Now, as we stand at the moment, the European Council hasn't penciled in a special council in November. What they appear to have said is, if we think the negotiations are making progress and you can give us a nod, well, then we might do that, but they didn't decide to do that at the last meeting. We recognised in our report, in fairness, that there may need to be some condensation of timetables depending on how far along the process you've got and how close to the wire we have come. Now, I hope we don't get to that point, but given the magnitude of the decision that we are taking, the British people have decided we're leaving the European Union, but the nature of our future relationship affects every single area of our national and public and business and personal lives, every single one. And therefore, to say that we should have a similar period of time to debate this in the House of Commons that we had at the time we took the decision to join the common market all those years ago, it seems pretty reasonable to me. And from the narrow committee's point of view, we noted the suggestion made by the Institute for Government that there should be 2 weeks between the deal being presented to the House and having the vote on it, not least because we as a committee want to take evidence from the Secretary of State and Ollie Robbins and produce a report to the House to assist the House in taking a decision. But I think 5 days is perfectly reasonable. And of course you've then got to have the waiver bill, the Withdrawal Agreement and Implementation Bill, put on the statute book. We don't know how extensive that is. We haven't seen it yet. I think it would assist if we saw it earlier, but it hasn't appeared yet. Nor has the Withdrawal Agreement, and nor has the Political Declaration, so we're somewhat in the dark.
Yes, with a ticking clock.
With a ticking clock, that is correct.
Peter.
Thank you, Chairman. As usual, Chairman, I tend to agree with what you're saying on this matter in relation to the fact that it does seem unlikely that there would be a no-deal scenario for the reasons that you outlined. But of course, who knows what would happen if the withdrawal agreement was voted down. It'd be such a significant piece of government legislation, the Prime Minister might even feel that she needs to resign if she lost that. But the Prime Minister today made it very clear that we are coming out of the European Union at the end of March. So it seems to be not reconcilable that if we have a vote in December even on the withdrawal agreement, that we could somehow get another agreement sorted out before the 29th of March. And the only way the solution that you propose, which seems logical to me, is that the House might vote to extend Article 50. That is complete contrast with what the Prime Minister has said today, very, very clearly at Prime Minister's questions. What is your view on that problem?
Well, I think governments hold to their policy until they are required by force of circumstances or change of mind to alter them. And of course, up until that moment, this is the government's policy. But if the government were to lose the withdrawal agreement vote, well, we'd be in a very different situation indeed, and the government might decide to change its policy. Now, you might go back to the EU and say, if the government says, OK, we're going to have a different approach, can we adjust the political declaration to reflect that? Because, as we know, because we have had 3 meetings now with Michel Barnier as the Select Committee, and he's always said from the start, there's basically 2 options, given your red lines. You can have a Canada deal, but if you're prepared to change your red lines, then you can have a Norway deal, but what you can't have is something that we don't recognise. And that's, I think, the difficulty with the Chequers proposal, because the EU said we don't recognise it, it doesn't work, it doesn't compute, and therefore it isn't acceptable. So it is possible for it to change.
So going back to the procedure that we were looking at, we had some very good evidence last week from Dominic Grieve and Sir Oliver
Yes.
Letman and one other person.
Chris Leslie.
And Chris Leslie. And they all started with the position that they really would like to see an amendable motion. But I think they, at the end, accepted that the government had to have a yes-no on the withdrawal agreement. And I think they were looking at a series of motions prior to that vote where the House would divide on, and to test the will of the House. So it might be about extending Article 50, a second referendum, or whatever, so that the government would then be informed, well, the House would be informed when they make that decision on either yes or no to the withdrawal agreement. And then subsequently, if that was defeated, the withdrawal agreement, the government already know the views of the House moving forward. Now, that seemed, I think, to get quite a lot of support from the three witnesses we saw. Would that satisfy you?
This is my personal view. This is somewhat akin, I think it's been called the smorgasbord approach, and it's somewhat akin to what happened with Lord's reform in 2003 and 2007. In 2003, everything was voted down, and in 2007, two of the options, 80 and 100%, as I recall, elected, were passed by the House, and nothing happened.
No, I think you'll find that the motion was passed substantially, but the programme motion wasn't put. It had one of the biggest majorities in the House. I do think the record should be clear that the House voted for Lord's reform, but the government didn't have the courage to put the programme motion.
Well, you are absolutely correct, and I mean, there's maybe an eternal or semi-eternal truth about Lord's reform. Nothing ever happens, apart from the removal of most of the hereditaries. I think I'm not terribly attracted to that. One, because you could end up with a number of options potentially gaining a majority. Two, I think it reduces the leverage, bluntly, that the House of Commons would have on the government. Because if the government knows that what happens on an amendment could well affect the vote on the main motion, it might be inclined to give some assurances. So to ward off, for example, an amendment about guaranteeing the House a vote on a treaty or treaties that arise out of the future negotiations, the government might say, we'll give an assurance that we will legislate in the Wade Bill to ensure that the House has a vote, and that might be a way of warding it off.
But why couldn't that be done in the motions before the vote?
Well, because you could do that then, but would the government pay any attention, I think is the point I'm making. Would it pay any attention to it? It might not. If its mind would be concentrated if the amendment was to its own motion. So if you link them, as is the traditional way, that's the way we normally do this, the government has to focus, pay attention, and see how it's going to handle it. But if in the end, regardless of what method is used, if the government wants to ensure it has a clean vote, I don't like the term myself because it suggests amendments are attempting to contaminate. And I think the House of Commons expressing a view is not contaminating anything, it's us doing our job. The government just has to make sure it defeats all of the amendments and it can have a vote on its motion. So it's in the government's hands. And even the way they... it's in the government's hands.
Bob, and then David.
Hilary, you mentioned, of course, two aspects of amendments that could be... Ones that could be actually amending the deal itself. So, for example, the government comes back with a proposed deal that has some form of customs arrangement, but colleagues feel that they want a customs union as opposed to a customs arrangement, which would amend the deal. And there are others that would be, shall we say, the process of agreeing treaties or whatever in the future, which are, I think, very different types of amendments. Would you not accept the fact that given this deal, whatever it looks like, is going to have to be approved by the European Parliament, 27 member states, the Euro Council and Parliament, that any amendment that amended the deal, the actual package, would be fatal to the deal, and therefore everything would have to go back to the drawing board if there's to be another deal, because the process of approval will have begun across Europe, hopefully.
Yeah, it's not unknown in negotiations for each side to go back to their members, in effect, and say, I'm afraid there's a bit of a problem here. Can we do something about it? I accept it's extremely difficult in these circumstances. I think there are diminishing degrees of fatality, if I may coin the phrase, in respect of the deal, because the legally binding treaty is the withdrawal agreement. Mm-hmm. And that's got the four parts: the money, the transition, the European citizens' rights, and if they can reach agreement on it, with the backstop, the Northern Ireland. And then there is the political declaration. Now, that does not have the force of a treaty. It will be attached to it. It's part of a package. The European Parliament will look at the treaty having regard to the political declaration. But if you have an amendment which says, we're happy to approve this, but we want the government to set out how, in the negotiations yet to come, it will ensure that we remain in a customs union with the European Union, I don't see that that is fatal, because that's about the objectives of the British government in a negotiation that is yet to come. And as long as it's not inconsistent with whatever the words say in the political declaration about the future relationship, then I don't see it's a problem. If the political declaration said, we both agree that never in a month of Sundays is the UK ever going to be in a customs union with the EU, you'd have a bit of a problem. But I doubt that it will say that. I expect it'll be somewhat more general. And so to say to one negotiating side, the UK government, this is what we want you to go and seek in those negotiations, doesn't seem to me, I really don't see how that could be fatal, or indeed get someone to go to the court and say you shouldn't have approved it.
So given that, do you think there should be two separate series of votes? One on the deal, which is the withdrawal deal, and one on the future negotiating position, which could arguably have a series of proposals which could make an a la carte menu that the House could vote on to instruct the government to go away and inform its future negotiations.
I do see that as an option. My concern about it and why I don't favour it is the same answer I gave to a previous question. I think it would reduce the House's leverage on the government in this process if you separate it out.
David.
Thank you, John. It's been really interesting, and I take on board a lot of what you've said, but there are three questions I wanted. The majority of my constituents just want us to get on with it. They don't want to have endless debates and everything else. They expect the government to come forward with a proposal and then the House to vote on it. If the House votes it down, the question then remains, as Peter said, whether the government, the Prime Minister, can continue. But I can't quite see why you're so adamantly against having general debates beforehand, where the generality and debates, people can put their points of view and everything, and get a feel. Because then if there was a yes-no vote only without amendment, and it was defeated, then the government would be well aware of what the debates had taken place previously. I can't see what is wrong with that approach, because the government has to govern and lead. And they will come back with proposals, and 5 days or whatever time it is to debate those particular proposals. But the government would then have an idea. And my fear is the same as you highlighted, everything could be voted down. That, like the House of Lords. You were rather more upbeat that one or two make it through, but I would look at it the other way and see maybe none of them will.
Yeah. Well, it's a complex process and it's going to take a long time, withdrawing from the European Union, for reasons I think that have become more apparent to everybody than was the case when the referendum was occurring. The reason I don't support that proposal is because it allows the House of Commons to express a range of views. Does the government have to pay any attention? No, it doesn't.
But it could vote down. The House of Commons could vote down the government's proposal.
Well, it could do that. Of course, it could do that, and it could do that under all of the range of options, which is why we're having the discussion in the first place. But this is our moment as the House of Commons. This is a hugely important decision for the future of the country.
Of course.
And I think to say, well, let's have a vote on this and a vote on that and the other, and the government might pay attention or it might not, and so on, doesn't, in my view, quite rise to the scale of the task. And the reason why the government, I would argue, has put in the memorandum proposing to change the approach is because it recognises there's a range of views. The government is not unaware. Blimey, after all of the debate and argument there's been,
of course,
right across the House, the government is not unaware of the different views there are about how we should deal with this.
Yeah.
But if we make it that there are amendments to the government's motion and they're voted on first, the House, one, has the chance to test whether there is support for an alternative approach, which could be in addition to the withdrawal agreement or in complete opposition to it, or add some process. And secondly, it would force the government to take the House of Commons seriously. And I think that's the best method, that is my personal view, the best method in those circumstances on this really, really important issue.
Thank you.
Bambos.
Hilary, if the just building on the thing that's been discussed by previous questioners, if there was an up-down deal, no-deal vote, and it was lost by the government, then there's a motion of confidence that was won by the government. Do you think there would be, and there was no prospect of there being a second referendum or a people's vote, do you then think there should be provision for Parliament to express its view that the government should go back and negotiate further? I think you said earlier that there's a majority in Parliament for a deal of some description. Do you think there should be some sort of vote following a no-deal vote for Parliament to express its view?
Well, I think the first answer I'd give it depends in what context the withdrawal agreement has been voted down. If it's just a straight defeat, then that doesn't really assist the government in understanding what was the reason why a majority of people decided to vote it down. Because we know from the range of views, you can have people opposing it because it keeps us too closely tied, and those who think it doesn't build a strong enough relationship. So completely opposite reasons. And that is the argument, again, for having a series of amendments where we can see if the majority of the House can come together if they want to, and if they don't want to and they're happy with the withdrawal agreement, they vote all of those down and they say, yeah, that's fine, off you go. But that is the process. So if we do it that way, then the government will have a clear idea why, and then it has to make the decision. So what are we going to do? And then it brings me to the answer I gave to Helen a moment ago. Responsibility falls first on the government. It's going to have to do something, because if its plan has been defeated, it's going to have to come up with another plan. And if it doesn't, then absolutely the House of Commons should have the chance to express its view about what should then happen.
So, Hilary, you mentioned that in Lord reforms nothing ever happens, but of course we don't have that luxury, do we, with the UK leaving the EU, because it's the 29th of March, so something's got to happen. And yeah, I would hope that the government is negotiating in good faith with the national interest at the centre of its negotiations. So the problem I've got both with a number of positions emerging is that everybody seems to want to have it their own way. So the government obviously has its concerns, and you've come here and you've said that what happened in October 1971 was particularly good, that there were 5 days debate. But you don't like the second half of that. In the second half of that, there was only one amendment tabled, and it wasn't called. And I do think that the British public will be amazed, because it's not as if the deal's going to be announced on a Monday and we're all going to gather on a Tuesday and vote that evening. The deal will be announced, there will be a period of time for reflection, there will be media calls, global statesmen travelling around the world. I do think the public would be slightly... no, I understate it, would be completely bemused if there wasn't a clear vote on, does the UK Parliament accept this deal, or does the UK Parliament not accept this deal? And that is the concern of... I don't care where that vote comes. I don't care really whether it becomes at the beginning of the day, or the 5 days, or at the end of the 5 days, but somewhere, for the sake of our electorate, for the sake of businesses, for the sake of people who employ people, there has to be a clear decision given when that deal gets put to the House. Well,
I absolutely understand that argument, and it is open to the House to give that clear decision, because it can defeat all of the amendments and
but
say yes or no. But
why don't we just follow the procedure, because you are attracted to the 1971 option, where there was one amendment tabled and that amendment wasn't called? Would you be happy with that?
Well, no, the committee, I'm now speaking for the committee again, because the committee said it thought that there should be the possibility of selecting a number of amendments, which is why we passed this particular challenge to you to advise on how that could be done, precisely because it's not like you've got, the government is all of one, government side all of one view, and the opposition is all of another view, in that sort of normal binary way. Brexit is not like that. We have differences of view within, certainly the two largest parties. We have some differences of view. And I think that the normal process, which is you vote on the amendments first before you vote on the main motion, I am, as you can tell, not persuaded why we should depart from that. That's the first point I wanted to make, and it came as a surprise when the government suggested that it wanted to. And the second is those range of views about our future relationship are reflected in the public. And I think it's really important to understand that. And for the public to see, well, what I was hoping for, whether it's, just leave and have nothing to do with the EU, right the way across to a people's vote and all the points in between. I think to say, by the process that we maybe will adopt, depending on your recommendations, and it's entirely a matter for you, and look forward to what you have to say we're organising it this way because there are a range of... We might as well be honest about the different views there are about the future. And remember, there are two parts to this. In the withdrawal agreement, provided the Northern Ireland thing is sorted, there's more or less consensus on those elements, citizens' rights, money, well, a bit of argument in one or two places, and the transition. Everyone is now converted to the transition. But all this is going to do is start a process about the future. And at the moment when we are going down a road that will lead to that future, for Parliament to say, well, this is the kind of relationship we want you to go and negotiate when you get to the part two of the negotiations, seems to be really quite easy to explain to people and a perfectly reasonable thing for the House of Commons to seek to do.
This is, isn't it? We cite the public, but there's the public that writes to us, which is a fraction of a fraction, and they tend to be at either ends of the argument. Then there's that public that don't write to us, which most of them, I think, when you meet them in the street, whatever their party politics, say, for crying out loud, just get on and get a deal so we can move on to other things. And shouldn't we reflect that view as well in the House?
Indeed. And I understand the frustration. But it's for Parliament to make that decision. And look, I voted for Article 50, talking for myself again, because I accept that we, the Remain side, lost the referendum. But there is a huge debate about what the future economic relationship is going to be. And I think we all recognise that. And this is a particular moment when the House has a chance, in effect, to mark the government's card about what it would like it to do in the future. And that may be different from what the government is hoping for the future. But one of the other difficulties with this process is we may not be very clear at all about what the government is seeking to negotiate in part two, because if we end up with a vague political declaration, we'll have the four bits we know about and fine words about wanting a close relationship. And if someone came to me and said, well, will that involve us being in a customs union or not? Or we'd have to say, we haven't got a clue.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for this. Hilary, I accepted the result of the referendum, voted for Article 50. I think there's a very healthy majority in the House for membership of the Customs Union because I think it protects trade, jobs and also deals with the Northern Ireland problem. What do you think the best process will be to arrive at that outcome?
Well, I think one for the House to have the chance, in effect, to give some negotiating instructions to the government for phase two, which is the future partnership negotiations, assuming the withdrawal agreement is passed. And secondly, getting the government to commit that we will vote on the treaty or treaties that emerge from those negotiations. Because at the moment, there is no such commitment. You have the CRAG process. Now, the CRAG process does allow members to pray against, but it doesn't guarantee time will be made available for a vote, and therefore Parliament could just have to sit there and watch a treaty that it didn't like go through. Now, I don't think that's taking back control. I think the mood is kind of swinging towards, because trade agreements involve a lot of important issues, some highly political and contentious, and I think legislatures should say, well, we want to have some say over this and not just leave it to governments to negotiate and approve using the royal prerogative.
Chris. Your premise is that if we were to leave without a deal, that would be a disaster. And I don't accept that premise, and I think a large number of my constituents don't either accept that premise. And they think that it would be much better to leave without a deal rather than be forced into having a bad deal, which seems to be the direction in which the government's going at the moment. But if you have a 5-day debate on this, then during that debate, as long as people are allowed to put down some amendments which are in order, then they can speak to those amendments, and the government will be able to have an idea, and the public will have an idea of where the balance of opinion lies from all those who will be able to participate in the debate, and almost everybody who wants to will be able to participate in a debate of that length. And so do we need to get hung up on the procedure as long as we got the ability for everybody to express their view? Do we really want to confront the government on this issue of whether we should be able to amend a motion so that it becomes of dubious legality? Do we really want to do that?
Well, yes, I think we do. And if one were to take the argument that you've just put and apply it more generally to Parliament's work, well, why don't we do that all the time? Just have a chat, express a view, and then leave the government to get on with it. And the argument that I'm making is that we don't do that. We have an established procedure for amendments that are taken before the main motion. That's point number one. And point number two, this is of such importance for the future of the country, for the reasons that I tried to set out earlier, that I think it's even more important we have a process that enables Parliament to clearly express its view, and that the government should feel we're going to have to take full account of that, and we're going to have to respect it, and we're going to have to accept it, rather than just say, well, that was all very interesting, but we're going to go on and do what we were going to do anyway.
But you'd accept that there's no way that Parliament can force the government to do anything if we vote down that motion?
That is, I'm not a lawyer, and I suppose legally that is correct, but politically that is not correct. Because if the government can't get its policy through the House, now whether there's a no confidence motion and it's carried or not, it's got a very, very big problem, and government in those circumstances, I think, would have to say, right, we've got a big problem, our preferred course of action has just been voted down, we're going to have to do something else. And I think that's the pressure that we bring to bear, and that is the way in which Parliament shows it does have power in this process, because the government in those circumstances surely would have to listen to what Parliament has had to say.
But surely it wouldn't be the government that would be at fault. It would be basically the government saying, we've done our best with these intransigent people in the European Union. This is the best they're prepared to deliver us. Do you in Parliament think that what they're prepared to give us in a deal instead of a no deal is worth having or not? We then have a vote on it. If Parliament says we prefer to have no deal rather than what's on offer, then won't my constituents, and perhaps not so many of yours, be throwing their hats in the air and saying that's great, because there was a binary choice, either we leave or remain, and there's no point in being half in and half out.
Well, this goes to the heart of the argument there is about what the referendum result meant. And that's the raging debate in British politics. I'm clear it means we're leaving the institutions of the European Union at the end of March. I'm also clear, speaking personally, that referendum did not decide the nature of our future relationship with our friends and neighbours. So that is the, it seems to me that is the argument, and I can't conceive of circumstances in which the House of Commons would vote to leave with no deal. But this is the political debate, and I come back to my original point. Precisely because there are these differing views, the House ought to have a chance to hear them, to vote on them, as the government puts its withdrawal motion.
David,
I just want to follow up from a point that Christopher made about, well, if we could have this 5-day debate and people could table amendments, not necessarily move them. I mean, I find myself in a bit of a difficult position here, because since I've been elected this House in June 2017, every single opposition day vote that is taking place in this House, the government has just ignored. So what makes you think that the government would even respect a meaningful vote?
Because of the nature of the issue. It would be a huge blow to the government if its preferred strategy and the deal it had brought back in pursuit of that was defeated. And I think the idea on this, that the government would say, well, that was all very interesting, get lost, I don't think would happen.
Could you foresee a situation where they do what they've been doing with opposition day votes, where they'll say, we'll spend 12 weeks consider it and come back with a statement?
Well, I don't think they can do that in this case, because in an opposition day motion, which the government hasn't participated in the vote for, nothing else is going to happen. But in this case, tick-tock, the clock is running down, and if you accept the argument that I've put, that I don't think any government would sit on its hands and result in us leaving with no deal, that is the pressure that will require the government to act. And the nation would say, well, Parliament's given you a view, given you some instructions, said it doesn't like what you're doing, you need to stand up and say, so what are you going to do now? So the government would have to respond, and it couldn't wait 12 weeks to do so.
It might say that.
Well,
it might say, for crying out loud, what have you clowns just done? We thought we had a deal here and now we've not got a deal and we could leave without a deal. So the nation could cut both ways on this.
How we vote as individual members of Parliament.
But that's not the nation could react in many different ways, and none of us have a monopoly of insight into how it might react.
I wonder what you think really would come out through the course of a further 5 days of debate and further motions. What new ideas, arguments, conversation would be brought to the table that hasn't already been covered at extraordinary length?
Well, I assume there'd be a lot of members that would want to contribute to
but
the
would there be anything
debate.
new?
But I think, well, new. I'll tell you what will be new. We don't currently know what any Northern Ireland backstop is going to look like. So that would be new. We have no idea what the future partnership document is going to say. That will be new. I don't know whether we're going to see a draft of that before they finally conclude.
But that relies on the government giving us that information, doesn't it?
No, indeed. But by the time we come to a debate, whether it's 5 days or however number of days, the government will have. It'll only happen if the government's reached an agreement, and it will have published the final version of the withdrawal agreement. Now, a lot of that is in green, which means it has been agreed. We read in the newspapers that the government has reached agreement on other things like the dispute resolution mechanism, but I can't tell you what that is because we haven't seen it. So there will be significant new elements that we will not have seen. And depending on how truncated the timetable is between them appearing at the council, shaking hands and saying we have a deal, and then coming back, it would then be published straight away, I'm sure, coming back to the House, and then the time that would be given, both so the Select Committee can hear from the Secretary of State and produce a report, and we'll do that very, very swiftly, and then have the debate and then have the vote. There'll be certain new things that we do need to take into account, which we won't have seen before. It's not all known.
Right, I think we might have grilled our witness for long enough.
Lightly toasted, I think.
45 minutes, which is longer.
Well, that's
than
very kind of you.
most people.
Well, I hope it's been helpful.
It has been
I've
very
enjoyed
helpful.
it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended.
Sitting through that and listening. I have one opening question before you make your. Would you like to make an opening statement?
Would that be okay?
Yeah, make an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm genuinely honoured to be asked to come today, but it's an honour coated with humility because I'm not one of nature's proceduralists, and you know the ways and anthropologies of your house far better than I ever will. And also, I think it's a bit careful, one has to be careful if one's an unelected member of the other house, not to interfere in Commons business. So I'm coated with humility and respect before I say anything else. Now, that said, I'm fascinated by your task, which it seems to me is to embroider a banner we can all rally round, wherever we stand on the European question, a procedural banner that will enable everyone to feel that what matters to them has had its moment in the chamber of the House of Commons as we engineer the greatest shift in our country's place in the world since we disposed of the territorial empire over 40 years between 1947 and 1980. Now, Brexit, I think, is stress-testing our nation, its institutions, its constitution, through a series of interlocking questions, of which Parliament is but one, though an absolutely crucial one. And for a time, your committee will be in the eye of the storm in a way that procedure committees rarely are. Future historians, I think, will linger long over the choreography that you craft as a result of this inquiry. And for a fleeting moment, the whole Brexit process will rest on you, and no procedure committee past, as far as I can tell, has ever had to carry such a weight. And I hope above all that you can produce what Philip Ziegler once described to my MA students as an instantly invented precedent to carry us through this extraordinary set of events that we're talking about. That's regarded by the public and everybody else as fair and produces a clean and unambiguous outcome, and above all is comprehensible to the electorate and the people. And every fibre of me wishes you well, as you seek to put the meaning in the meaningful vote.
Gosh, if only I could speak like that.
Oh, that's very kind of you, Mr. Chair.
Well, lovely. Absolutely wonderfully put. How important, where does this vote stand in the pantheon of votes, potentially, this meaningful vote taken since, say, 1946?
Well, I suppose one has to start with the Norway debate in 1940, which was extraordinary. The vote that was won by the national government but brought down Neville Chamberlain nonetheless, that takes the palm for the most significant vote probably ever in modern times. But it certainly stands with the vote on the 28th of October 1971, when Ted Heath got his majority of 112 to approve the white paper which had the terms of the agreement in it, in principle. And it's known as the clavichord vote, isn't it? Because he went back to number 10, overcome with emotion, and sat down at his clavichord and played, I think, the prelude to Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1, and then composed himself. So it's known as the great clavichord moment. And it's very instructive to revisit that one. We can come back to that one in a minute, because it's the only sliver of precedent we've got for what you're facing. And it's not in any way near an exact precedent. But I do think it was extraordinary, though I would add, though it's no way is this part of the folk memory, that the greatest chunk of sovereignty we ever gave away was the NATO Treaty, Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. It dwarfs the sovereignty we gave away, or it turns out temporarily, to the EEC and its successor community bodies. But the House of Commons wasn't exercised by that, particularly. It wasn't a great showdown. And we tend to remember only the great showdown votes. And of course, if we get a deal, it will be a great showdown occasion. And that's right, because the place for a country like ours, an open society and a parliamentary system, the greatest showdowns should take place in the elected chamber. So it's first order question, this one, but there's very little to guide us from the past. And given that the great Kenneth Pickthorne said in the House of Commons debate in 1960 that procedure is all the constitution the poor Britain has, there's a lot resting on you.
Well, that's a happy little thought. David. Oh, no, sorry. Will, and then David.
Thank you, Lord Hennessy. I think you're renowned for your great regard for Parliament and the Constitution unwritten as it is. And of course, this is a procedure committee. It's perhaps not the forum for questioning procedure and the nuances and the permutations and combinations that we can have of it. But in your experience, what is the impression you think would be created if there were not that straightforward accept or aye or no on the government's deal that it brings back, if that were not put first?
If I was a member of your House, I would be very much persuaded by the evidence you were given by Honourable Edwin and Dominic Grieve about the need for a clean vote in the process somewhere. I think that's absolutely crucial. And The balance of power between the executive and the legislature is something that we all worry about. It's a kind of floating exchange rate phenomenon, day by day, and we all know that. You've lived with it all your time, all of you in this chamber. But having said that, the government needs its moment on the floor just as much as anybody else does. One of the properties that's so difficult, made the European question so difficult for the British people to handle, I mean, there's many reasons why we can't handle it. It doesn't fit our left-right structure of politics. We didn't invent the idea in the first place. There's all sorts of psychological problems we've got with it. But it has this terrible property to turn into a grievance question, a grudge question. And indeed, I've been rereading the White Paper of 1971, which, by the way, is beautifully written. I don't want to sound like an old buffer, but of course that's exactly what I do sound, sitting before you like a tweedy old husk. But White Papers were beautifully written in those days. It's before the management consultants got anywhere near Whitehall. And so whatever you think about certain passages, particularly that one saying there'd be no serious erosion of national sovereignty, which lit a fuse beneath the whole enterprise, as it turns out. It's beautifully written. But I'm losing my way now. What was my point? It'll come back to me.
The impression that would be created if there were not a clear-cut...
Oh yes, absolutely.
First.
Given that everybody must feel they've had their moment in that 5-day debate, and it surely can't be less than 5 days, even though nobody will have any new formulations to bring to the table particularly. You need to go through the process of catharsis, and choreography is very necessary for that. But everybody who's partisan or party to the European question, which is all of us, must feel that they actually, the thing that they care about most, had its moment, and that the House was given a chance to express its mind on it. So I was very taken with the way both Dominic Grieve and Oliver Letwin put it to you.
I will come to you, but I've got to go to David. Yes.
Yes, sorry, there are too many David.
Sorry, am I...
No, that's fine. So I've been asking every witness that's come before the committee, you're obviously a member of the other place when that legislation was going through. When that legislation was going through the other place, what was your understanding of what a meaningful vote was?
Well, it was all wonderfully vague, but I think, as these things are, I mean, there's a great line of Winston Churchill's in the second reading debate on the Iron and Steel Bill in 48. He said, the British cannot see a line without instantly wanting to blur it. And so there's a lot of that going on. But what the meaning in the meaningful vote meant was you're refining it, the evidence you're getting, and I think really, I would just repeat what I said a moment ago, that it has to be, the test of it, and the test of what you produce is that people do not feel even more aggrieved at the outcome at the end of those 5 days, that they've had their moment. The trouble is with the European question, it's I used to know him a little bit, Lord Rothschild, Victor Rothschild, who was head of Ted Heath's think tank. And Victor once said that government is like Aldous Huxley's description of life, as routine punctuated by orgies. And the trouble with the European question is when it's routine, it is unbelievably boring. It takes the palm for tedium. And then all of a sudden, with nothing in between, it becomes orgiastic. And it makes the political weather and drives otherwise calm people to distraction.
I definitely did not expect to discussing orgies at the Procedure Committee, but yeah. So I think, I mean, I think one of the other questions that I've got is, we obviously have constituents and we're guided by the public. I mean, what do you think the public actually think of this process, and what do you think the public want to see out of this?
Well, what I hear everywhere, including from yourselves, is that the public just want us to get on with it. Actually, the disposal of a big geopolitical relationship is always more difficult and time-consuming than acquiring it. I mean, of course, there were great fights from the 1961 first application onwards, and the resistance was very eloquent on sovereignty grounds in particular in the run-up to Ted Heath getting his 112 majority. But people are fed up to the back teeth with it. It's never been... even if you're a nerd, as I was born a nerd, I'm a complete nerd, but it's very difficult to keep in one's head exactly what the European community has been about at any particular time. We all have a different map in the mind of what it is, and it became the lightning conductor for both extraordinary hopes and also deep resentments right from the beginning. So people are just fed up to the back teeth with it. I think people would settle for a period of tedium and stability, and that's the one thing we're not going to get. But also I think, when you think about the European question, we historians love dividing things up into capital Q questions, and there are 7 questions that we're living with that are living in symbiotic relationship. One is the European question, of course, but it's reopened Britain's place in the world question powerfully. It has reopened the Irish question. It's also, in the long term, probably given a great boost to the question of the very union of the UK question, with the possibility of a Scottish separation in the mid-2020s. It's reopened, the referendum has the condition of Britain questions, to use a Disraelian phrase, because even those of us who thought we knew about the differences in lives and life chances within our borders I certainly hadn't fully appreciated that until the vote expressed it. And also, as part of the stress testing, it's opened the very Parliament, the question of Parliament. That if Parliament isn't central to the outcome in the way it conducts itself and the influence it has through its votes on the final deal, if we get one, it will diminish this institution at a time when it's the last thing we need, anything to diminish the reputation of Parliament. And of course, there's all sorts of spectres at the feast that come crowding in. I was listening to you when Hilary Benn was giving evidence. The House of Lords, is an absolute nightmare. It's as everybody worries about those House of Lords votes as a harbinger of what might be about to become on the European question. But the House of Lords is the Bermuda Triangle of British politics, isn't it? Every 2 generations, politicians go into it to try and sort it out. Some never reappear. Others come back singed and dazed and vowing one thing, never to go anywhere near the question again. So I think the House of Lords is not a red herring exactly, but it doesn't help very much, does it? But that is worrying people. That was a very mixed answer, I'm sorry about that.
Nic.
Thank you, Chair. And then for Parliament to be central and for there to be some transparency about process to the public.
Yeah.
Listening to the evidence we heard last week from Dominic Oliver and Chris Leslie, there was both the focus on the need for a clarity around vote, but there was also a concern that something should be amendable so that it was clear, and the idea of focusing down to a final decision. How important do you think it is that amendments should be able to be considered in this process?
I think it's crucial to it, and I think before the clear run vote, actually. Now, that would be my preference if I was here. Of course, the 1971 debate, 5-day debate, only helps a little bit because there's only one amendment, and it was Willie Hamilton's one. But he, in effect, turned it into a confidence motion that the Prime Minister should be required to hold a general election because the Heath government was so disastrous on all the fronts of unemployment and lack of investment and all the rest of it. And Speaker, I think it was Horace King, declined to give reasons. The debate opened with Willie Hamilton trying to get the Speaker to give his reasons why he hadn't taken the amendment, and he declined to do so. But it didn't seem to fit the main motion. Yeah. It, in effect, was a confidence motion. So that doesn't help you at all, really, just the one amendment, because it was a trial, wasn't it? Mm. Willie Hamilton was a great man, and indeed he was a pro-European of a sort of slightly mild, sceptical sort, as he said in that debate. So that one amendment in October 71 doesn't really help you, does it? But I do think it's absolutely important that the mind of the Commons is apparent to everybody. Yeah. And that's the way to do it, I would have thought. So the norm... If I shouldn't presume, I am presuming now, but I'm sure you will write a report which is convertible into a comprehensible account of Parliament's procedures and the centrality of Parliament to this, but also the novelty of it. Because you're treading where nobody's had to tread before. This is constitutionally and procedurally a very creative moment for you. So it'll take a bit of explaining. And if it was falling to me, which I thank God it isn't, when I was a journal on the Times in long ago and far away, when we thought the first language of the readership was Latin, that's how old I am, we were taught to write as if we were writing for a clever sixth former in the north of England. I don't know why the north of England was chosen, who had bags of curiosity but no prior knowledge. And that's one of the tests, I think, that you might need to apply to your report. Would that actually work if it was in a current affairs discussion in a school, sixth form? Would they be able to understand the procedures you're outlining and where it fits within or doesn't fit within the normal procedures of the House of Commons and what's gone before? So if I can suggest, you might need a preamble that sets the context and that leads the reader in to understand exactly why this is special and what's novel, and in the requirements you're going to be laying down, whether you do it as a recommended one route to it or whether you have a set of options. That's me as an old journo speaking, so I hope you don't think I'm being presumptuous, Chairman.
But you're very clear that the normal process whereby we have a motion which is then has amendments and those amendments are taken first would work very well in terms of helping the Parliament assert itself in a way which has a clarity to the public.
I find that argument persuasive, yeah. Yeah, but you know your house better than I do.
Well, I'm not sure about
that. Helen.
Lord Hennessy, I'm a bit puzzled. You've said two completely contradictory things in the last half hour.
Well, do help me out.
On the one hand, I'll take a step back. You're saying this is an important moment for Parliament.
Yeah.
Do you take that to mean that this is a moment where Parliament asserts its authority and holds the executive to account?
Yes, while saying also that the government must have its clean run.
Well, this is where I'm just completely confused by what you're saying. Because on the one hand, you've just said to my colleague Nic Dakin, let's have amendments and then a vote. On the other hand, you've said you thought that the evidence produced by Oliver Letwin and Dominic Grieve last week, which would pull the teeth from Parliament's power because resolutions in parallel to the main motion would have no force whatsoever. So which of those propositions do you really...
I think I must have misunderstood. I thought I'd read it carefully too, Dominic's evidence and Oliver Letwin's. But, so forgive me, it's my misreading. At least you think it's my misreading of what they said. But I take Nick's point. I think that's the way to do it.
I see. Thank you very much.
Thank you for helping me out.
I'm intrigued by what you said to us this afternoon, but there are two things. I mean, first of all, if I can't see why a general debate before the substantive motion can't elucidate all views in the House of Commons, and then a vote on the government's proposal afterwards. However, if we went down your route and had the amendments, as you suggested, what happens if all of the amendments fail, as they have done in previous House of Lords reform things, and the government motion fails as well? We're kind of nowhere.
Well, I wish I knew, because we've never been in a position like that before.
That's why it's a unique experience.
I got a terrible record as a forecaster and a horizon scanner. And so this is where the humility gene kicks in, or gland kicks in again. I have no idea we'd be in terra incognita.
Yes.
And the fluidity of the political circumstances and the raw politics of it, we can only guess at, can't we?
Yes.
In a House of Commons where the parliamentary arithmetic is fluid, at the best of times, I mean, you live with it every day,
yes,
but it'll be fluid with a capital F.
Indeed.
I have no idea how we come out of that.
No, and that's the thing. But what is wrong with, I mean, if they didn't have the amendments on you know, Hilary made the point that there's so many different views, but there were huge different views before my time. I was still at LSE enjoying education in those days, but there were huge differences then. It wasn't done on a party political basis when Heath took us into the European Union. Right. So it's not that different then, as the chairman highlighted, to now, in the sense that the parties are split and divided.
And also over the same questions in many ways.
Yes.
Although it was about trade and economy at that time, there wasn't the political union was there in the treaty, and Ted Heath was the white paper was quite eloquent about one day we'll get round to all the politics of it.
Yes.
But it was. But I remember, I wish I could remember the words exactly. Enoch Powell went to the Brussels Press Club in September 1972, before, when the legislation was passed, but before we acceded. And he said, in so many words, that the British people will wake up to the fact that this isn't just about trade, but it was about employment, environment, industry, and yes, even immigration. And in a strange way, he was very prophetic about the nature of the way the debate went. But when you look again at those debates, The sovereignty question has always been lurking. I mean, more than lurking, it's predominant. And as I'm a Remainer, but the force of the sovereignty arguments of my Leave friends has always been the one that's had the greatest force for me. So all the ingredients were there before. Do you remember the great Alan Watkins, who was the political columnist of the Observer for years? Yeah. He used to reckon that British politics was like an old movie town, newsreel. It just reran the same stories, sometimes in colour, sometimes with better sound than others. But essentially, British politics was a rerun of the same questions in a slightly different form. And the European question has been exactly like that since Jean Monnet turned up out of the blue from Paris in May 1950 with the Coal and Steel Community Plan. And our left-right politics couldn't handle it then. And I've always thought that the real problem stems from that, because when you think about institutions, you think about the mind out of which the first bit of the concept came. Who were they? What was their formation? And the coal and steel community idea comes out of the mind of clever, Catholic, left-wing French bureaucrats. Clever, Catholic, left-wing French bureaucrats. And most Brits have got a problem with 3 of the 5. But I haven't, as it happens, but most Brits have. Whereas if we'd invented it, it would be so different. There'd be a tiny secretariat in an area of high unemployment, which would put out perhaps 4 letters a year to the participating nations. Would you mind doing a little bit more on free trade here, and maybe here, but only if you've got time? But it didn't come out of our heads, did it? And we've been living with those consequences ever since. And also the other problem we've got, which is since 1975, is that we've found it so difficult to handle this question through our normal representative democracy. We've outsourced it to referenda. And what we're living with, and you're classically in the eye of this storm, is an attempt to bring running 2 systems of democracy in parallel is very tricky. And you're trying to bring the consequences of plebiscitary democracy within the proper orbit of representative democracy. Yes. It's extremely difficult to do.
That's a good point.
And that, I think, is the big picture. That's what I think the PhD students in 50 years' time will descend upon above all. And they'll descend upon you in particular.
Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm enjoying the evidence very much.
I'm just to go back to what Helen said and Nic, we've got to, if this is the challenge, I'm not sure we'll find a procedure that is compatible with this. It may be for others who have even greater brains than this committee's collective brain to decide on it. Whereas Parliament, in an ideal world, can express a strong view and a view, but likewise the government can have its question put in a way that is clean and the public understand.
Yeah.
So we have to match those.
That's what I think you've got to do above all.
I wish you did know about procedure, because perhaps you could tell us how we could do it.
I wish I had that kind of mind, but I very quickly lose my way when one gets into what I call the Narzler-Lisbane country.
So that is the challenge.
Yes, I think that's it. I think that's what it is. Looking at you sympathetically from outside, if I can put it that way. That's it. And if you can find a way through, the hosannas of a grateful nation will be yours for the taking, won't they? We're looking very serious, Chairman.
I think, Chris, and then we'll call it a day, because I promised I'd only keep you here for 15 minutes, Lord Hennessy.
Can I ask Lord Hennessy whether he thinks it's more important to ensure that we are able to give Parliament a view on a clean issue as to whether or not they approve of the withdrawal agreement, or we should allow, or is it more important that Parliament should be allowed to amend that withdrawal agreement motion in such a way as may make it impossible for the government to accept it because it will amount to a failure to approve?
But I was very struck what Hilary said about varying degrees of fatality. It's the kind of, not the Undertaker's view of fatal motions, because you're either dead or not. But there's degrees of fatality, isn't there?
Well,
and also, I think Hilary was very interesting about the government coming back with something else, which the Withdrawal Act allows for, doesn't it? I mean, it prescribes the period of time after which the government has to come back with something if the House of Commons doesn't go along with it.
Well, in answer to your question about that, it doesn't have to come back with anything other than a statement. A statement,
yeah.
That's all. It doesn't have to do anything. Yeah. But one thing that seems to have emerged in the evidence is that it would be possible to amend the approval motion if the amendments relate to what would happen after the implementation of what is being approved. So, for example, relating to
the future relationship.
The future relationship.
Yes.
And if such amendments could be in order, and they would not undermine the approval motion if passed, then would you see that as a sort of way forward?
Well, this is where my non-proceduralist mind gets a bit stuck. But I think I can see that argument. And the future relationship bit is we haven't talked about that much. The declaration of the future relationship. I mean, all sorts of possibilities are there because of even if it goes well for the government, it'll be a wonderfully imprecise declaration of future relationship, won't it? Almost certainly. And so the possibilities for amendment there will be very considerable, I would have thought.
Can I finally ask, as a member of in the other place, you will be charged with looking at the any withdrawal agreement implementation bill.
Yeah.
How long do you think you and your fellow lordships will be wanting to spend discussing that bill?
Well, my colleagues in the House of Lords react to this question in a way they react to no other. And vast numbers of people want to speak always. And the metabolic rate, how can one put it tactfully? I have to be very careful here. People get very agitated by this, so I suspect it will be quite a long time. And also, we have as a House a gift for being what Hugh Dalton once accused the Treasury civil servants of being when he was Chancellor. We're congenital snag hunters. But that's one of the functions of the House of Lords, is to be congenital snag hunters. It's called, that's what a revising chamber is for. So I suspect a long time will be required. And also the other factor in the House of Lords, which I find fascinating as a historian. I mean, one of the great pleasures of being in the Lords, if you're a historian of modern British politics, is you get to have lunch with your exhibits. When you look at the average age of them, I think they're 69 or something like that. There are many people in there who have devoted their lives to getting us in the first place, the more senior, and making it work while we were in the European community in its various forms. Equally, there are people who have devoted their entire political lives to getting us out. And what is so vexing, I think, for my colleagues, although I am being presumptuous now speaking in this way, as it is for many in your chamber, is that nobody on either side of the debate is entirely satisfied with what's likely to emerge, because both sides of the great argument feel that their position has been caveated away. So it's a deeply depressing spectacle. And again, it's like nothing else we've faced. I mean, you need an anthropologist, really, to explain a lot of this. But boring it ain't. and also, I long for the day when the only regular irritation to reach our country from our shores from Europe is our inability to win the sodding Eurovision Song Contest. But those days are long away.
Right, well, what an appropriate place to stop, the Eurovision Song Contest. Something that certainly captures the hearts and minds of many of my constituents. Well, thank you very much, Lord Hennessy, and for giving us your time and wisdom and insight. I think we're now going, well, I know we're going to meet in private for a little while before wending our way into the gloaming. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Meeting is currently in private.